The vast wilderness of the Cascade Mountains doesn't forgive mistakes. Just ask Tanner Coleman, a seasoned park ranger who spent 20 years navigating its treacherous terrain. But nothing in his 2 decades of experience prepared him for what happened on that foggy October morning. What began as a routine patrol turned into a rescue mission when he spotted what appeared to be a lost child wandering alone on a dangerous ridge. As he raced against an approaching storm to bring the small figure to safety, Tanner had no idea that his act of heroism would soon become the most embarrassing moment of his career, and the beginning of an unexpected friendship that would change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tanner Coleman took another sip from his thermos as the first light of dawn brushed against the jagged peaks of the Cascade Range. At 52, his weathered face told the story of a man who had spent most of his life in these mountains. The creases around his eyes deepened when he squinted at the horizon, where dark clouds were gathering in the distance. "Gonna be a bad one," he muttered to himself, screwing the cap back on his thermos and tucking it into his backpack. The radio on his belt crackled to life. "Bays to Coleman. You copy?" Tanner unclipped the device. "Coleman here. Go ahead, Diane. Weather. Service just upgraded the storm warning. They're saying it'll hit around noon instead of evening. You might want to wrap up early today." "Copy that. I'll finish the North Ridge Patrol and head back." Diane's voice softened slightly. "Be careful out there." "Always am," Tanner replied, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. His reputation for taking risks to ensure the safety of others was well established among the staff at Evergreen Ridge National Park. As he hiked along the narrow trail that wound through the dense pine forest, Tanner found himself enjoying the solitude. Ever since his divorce 3 years ago, the mountains had become more than just his workplace. They were his sanctuary. Out here, the complexities of human relationships gave way to simpler challenges: weather, terrain, and survival. By mid-morning, Tanner had reached Hawks Point, a rocky outcropping that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. The storm clouds had moved closer, bringing with them a thick blanket of fog that was rapidly enveloping the lower slopes. He pulled out his binoculars for one last sweep of the area before heading back to base. That's when he saw it. A small figure moving erratically along the edge of Deadman's Ridge, about half a mile away. Through the swirling mist, Tanner could make out what appeared to be a child in a bright yellow jacket, dangerously close to the precipitous drop. "What the hell?" he breathed, adjusting the focus on his binoculars. The ridge was far from any marked trails and notorious for its unstable footing. No experienced hiker would venture there, let alone a child. Without hesitation, Tanner radioed in. "Base, I've spotted what looks like a lost child on Deadman's Ridge. I'm going to intercept." "Deadman's? Are you sure?" Diane's voice was tense. "Affirmative. Small figure, yellow jacket. Can't be more than 8 or 9 years old from the size. Storm's coming in fast. No time for a team. Tanner, wait for backup. Can't risk it. That kid's one wrong step away from a 300-foot drop. I'll keep you posted." Ignoring Diane's protests, Tanner switched off his radio and began descending. From his position, plotting the fastest route to reach the child, the fog was thickening by the minute, threatening to obscure his view completely. He needed to move quickly. The approaching storm had brought with it a biting wind that cut through Tanner's ranger jacket as he made his way across a scree slope, loose rocks shifting treacherously beneath his boots. Years of experience had taught him where to place each foot, how to distribute his weight to avoid triggering a slide. But his mind wasn't on his own safety. It was fixed on the child who had no business being out here alone. As he drew closer, the fog parted momentarily, giving him another glimpse of the yellow jacket. The figure had stopped moving and appeared to be sitting on a boulder. Relief washed over Tanner. At least the kid wasn't right at the edge anymore. "Hey there," he called out, his voice carried away by the wind. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." "To help!" No response. The figure remained still. The last 100 yards to reach the ridge were the most challenging. Tanner had to use his hands at times, gripping exposed tree roots and rock outcroppings to pull himself up the steep incline. His heart pounded in his chest, partly from exertion and partly from concern for the child who might be injured or in shock. Finally, he created the ridge and saw the yellow jacket about 50 feet away. The fog swirled between them, but he could make out a small-statured person sitting with their back to him. "Hey, buddy," Tanner called out, keeping his voice gentle as he approached slowly. "I'm Tanner. I'm a park ranger. Are you hurt?" The figure turned, and Tanner caught a glimpse of a pale face partially obscured by a hood. Still no response. "It's okay," he continued, moving closer. "I'm here to help you get back to safety. There's a big storm coming. We need to get you." Down from this ridge, when he was about 15 feet away, the figure stood up and Tanner noticed something odd. Despite the small stature, the movements weren't those of a child. There was a certain deliberateness, a maturity in the posture. "I appreciate your concern," came a woman's voice, clear and decidedly adult, "but I don't need rescuing." Tanner stopped in his tracks, confusion washing over him as the figure pushed back her hood, revealing a woman's face, one marked by the distinctive features of dwarfism. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with short auburn hair and a pointed expression that suggested she was used to such misunderstandings. Tanner stammered, suddenly aware of his mistake. "I'm sorry. From a distance I thought that I was a lost child." She smiled, but there was a hint of resignation in it. "It happens more often than you'd think." The wind picked up, sending a spray of light rain across the ridge. The storm was nearly upon them. "Well, lost child or not, this ridge isn't safe," Tanner said, regaining his composure. "That storm's going to hit any minute, and when it does, this whole area will be too dangerous to navigate." The woman looked past him at the approaching wall of dark clouds and frowned. "I didn't realize it was moving in so quickly. I checked the forecast before heading out, but it said afternoon." "It got upgraded," Tanner explained. "Look, Ms. Mackenzie, Dr. Emily Mackenzie." She extended a hand, which Tanner shook, noting the firm grip. "Dr. Mackenzie, I'm Ranger Tanner Coleman. And while I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, I still need to get you off this ridge. It's called Dead Man's for a reason." A crash of thunder punctuated his words, causing both of them to glance anxiously at the sky. "Point taken," Emily said. "Lead the way, Ranger Coleman." As they began moving away from the edge, Tanner's radio crackled back to life. He switched it on to hear Diane's concerned voice. "Coleman, do you copy? Status report on the child." Tanner winced, glancing at Emily, who raised an eyebrow. "Base, this is Coleman. Situation is different than assessed. Subject is Dr. Emily. Mackenzie, an adult hiker. We're both fine and heading back now. Over." There was a pause before Diane responded, clearly processing this information. "Copy that. Storm's picking up speed. Get back as quickly as you can." "Will do. Over and out." As he clipped the radio back to his belt, Tanner couldn't quite meet Emily's eyes. "Sorry about that." "Don't be," she said with a shrug. "Like I said, it happens, though usually not in the middle of a pending natural disaster." The first real drops of rain began to fall as they made their way along the ridge toward the main trail. Tanner kept a careful eye on their surroundings, all too aware of how quickly conditions could deteriorate in mountain storms. "So, Dr. Mackenzie," he said, partly to distract from the awkwardness and partly out of genuine curiosity, "what brings you out to Deadman's Ridge? Not exactly a tourist destination." Emily stepped carefully over a fallen branch before answering. "I'm a geologist. Specifically, I study fault lines and seismic activity. This ridge has some interesting formations that might indicate a previously undocumented fault line." Tanner looked at her with newfound interest. "You're here professionally, and then?" "Semi-professionally," she admitted. "I teach at Western State University, but this is more of a personal research project. The department wasn't convinced it was worth a full expedition, so I decided to do some preliminary work on my own." "Alone? On one of the most dangerous ridges in the park?" Tanner couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Emily shot him a look that was half amusement, half defiance. "I've been hiking and rock climbing since I was 12. I'm more capable than I look, Ranger Coleman." Tanner raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I didn't mean to imply—" "Yes, you did," she cut him off, but there was no real anger in her tone. "It's fine. Between being a woman, being 4'2", and having achondroplasia, I've spent my entire life dealing with people underestimating me. You get used to it." The rain was falling steadily now, and the wind had picked up, bending the tops of the pine trees around them. They had reached the main trail, but they were still a good 4 miles from the ranger station. "We need to move faster," Tanner said, eyeing the darkening sky. "There's a shelter about a mile ahead. We might need to wait out the worst of it there." As if to emphasize his point, a jagged bolt of lightning split the sky, followed almost immediately by a deafening crash of thunder. "That was close," Emily remarked, pulling her yellow jacket tighter around her. "Too close," Tanner agreed. "Come on." They quickened their pace, but the trail was already becoming slick with mud. Tanner noticed that despite her shorter legs, Emily kept up remarkably well, moving with the sure-footedness of an experienced hiker. They had covered about half the distance to the shelter when the storm hit in full force. Rain came down in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. The wind howled through the trees, sending broken branches crashing down around them. "Watch out!" Tanner shouted, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her back, just as a large limb crashed onto the trail where she had been about to step. "Thanks," she gasped, eyes wide as she took in the size of the branch. It could have caused serious injury. "This is getting too dangerous," Tanner said, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "The shelter's still half a mile ahead. There's a small cave just off the trail about 100 yards from here. It's not comfortable, but it's safer than this." Emily nodded her agreement, and they left the trail, Tanner leading the way through the underbrush. The cave, really more of an overhang, came into view, a shallow indentation in the rocky hillside, but deep enough to provide shelter from the rain and falling debris. They ducked inside, both of them soaked to the skin despite their rain gear. The cave was roughly 10 feet deep and about the same in width, with a ceiling just high enough for Tanner to stand upright. It was dry, though, and out of the wind. "Not exactly 5-star accommodations," Emily remarked, wringing water from her. "Auburn hair. Better than being out there," Tanner replied, shrugging off his backpack. He rummaged inside and pulled out a small emergency blanket, which he offered to Emily. "Here, you should try to get warm." She accepted it with a nod of thanks and wrapped it around her shoulders while Tanner dug deeper into his pack. "Let's see. I've got some beef jerky, a couple of energy bars, and—" He smiled triumphantly as he pulled out his thermos, about half a thermos of coffee. "Still warm, probably. Ranger Coleman, you just moved up to 4 stars in my book," Emily said with a grin. They sat side by side against the back wall of the cave, sharing the thermos cap of coffee between them as the storm raged outside. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and despite the emergency blanket, Emily was shivering. "So," Tanner said, trying to keep the conversation going to distract from their predicament. "Western State University? That's in Millfield, right? About 3 hours from here?" Emily nodded. "I've been there for 6 years now, tenure track, though that's looking less certain after my department chair shot down my research proposal." "The one about the fault line?" "Yeah. Professor Lawrence thinks I'm chasing ghosts. There's no evidence of seismic activity in that region, Dr. Mackenzie," she mimicked in a pompous tone. Perhaps your time would be better spent on more established research areas. And you disagree? Emily's eyes lit up with a passion that transformed her face. The geological formations on this ridge don't make sense without some kind of tectonic activity. The layers are all wrong, and there are historical accounts from the native tribes that describe what could only be an earthquake right in this area about 300 years ago. I've never heard of any earthquakes around here, Tanner admitted. Exactly. That's what makes it potentially groundbreaking. If I can prove there's an undocumented fault line here, it could change how we understand the seismic risk for this entire region. Tanner couldn't help but be impressed by her enthusiasm. So you decided to come out and gather evidence on your own, even with a storm in the forecast? Emily had the grace to look slightly abashed. I might have underestimated the weather and overestimated how much I could accomplish in one day. Happens to the best of us, Tanner said with a chuckle. Though usually not to geology professors on unsanctioned research expeditions. A comfortable silence fell between them as they listened to the storm. The rain continued to pour, but the thunder had moved further away, suggesting the worst might be passing. Can I ask you something? Emily said suddenly. Sure. What made you become a park ranger? You don't strike me as someone who just fell into the job. Tanner took a moment before answering, surprised by how perceptive her question was. I was an environmental lawyer in Seattle for almost 20 years. Had the corner office, the expensive suits, the whole package. What changed? My son Tyler died in a car accident. He was 17. Tanner said it matter-of-factly, though the pain was still there, buried beneath years of grief. After that, the case files and legal briefs just seemed meaningless. Tyler and I used to come out here hiking every summer. These mountains were the one place where I felt like I could still connect with him. Emily's expression softened. I'm so sorry. Tanner nodded his acknowledgement. My wife, ex-wife now, wanted to move away, start fresh somewhere else, but I couldn't leave. So I stayed, got certified as a ranger, and here I am, 7 years later, still talking to my son on these trails. Do you regret it? Leaving your old life behind? Not for a second, Tanner said without hesitation. Out here I feel like what I do matters. I've rescued lost hikers, helped injured climbers, and protected this land from people who would damage it. It's not saving the world, but it's real in a way that pushing papers never was. Emily nodded thoughtfully. I understand that. It's why I became a geologist instead of following my parents into medicine. They wanted me to specialize in dwarfism research. They thought I'd have a personal stake in it. But I wanted to study something bigger than myself, something that would be here long after I'm gone. Like mountains and fault lines, Tanner suggested. Exactly. Like mountains and fault lines, Emily agreed with a smile. Though my parents still think I chose rocks over a lucrative medical career just to spite them. Tanner laughed. Did you? Maybe a little, Emily admitted with a mischievous glint in her eye. But mostly, I just fell in love with geology. There's something humbling about studying processes that take millions of years. Makes human problems seem pretty small in comparison. The rain had lessened to a steady drizzle, and the wind had died. Down considerably. Tanner checked his watch. They'd been in the cave for almost an hour. I think we can risk heading back now, he said, standing up and stretching his stiff muscles. The ranger station is still about 3 miles from here. Think you're up for it, Dr. Mackenzie? Emily folded the emergency blanket and handed it back to him. Lead the way, Ranger Coleman. And after sharing coffee and life stories while hiding from a storm, I think you can call me Emily. Only if you call me Tanner, he replied, repacking his backpack. As they stepped out of the cave and back onto the muddy trail, the sun was making a valiant effort to break through the clouds. The forest around them dripped with rainwater, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. So, Tanner said as they began their journey back, about this fault line theory of yours. What kind of evidence were you hoping to find today? Emily's face lit up again as she launched into an explanation of rock striations and mineral deposits that might indicate seismic activity. Tanner found himself genuinely interested, asking questions that prompted even more detailed responses. By the time the ranger station came into view, 2 hours later, they were deep in conversation about the geological history of the Cascades. Neither of them noticed Diane watching their approach with a puzzled expression until they were almost at the steps. "Well," she said, taking in their mud-splattered appearance and animated conversation. "This isn't quite what I expected when you radioed in about rescuing a lost child." Tanner felt his face flush slightly. "Diane, this is Dr. Emily Mackenzie from Western State University. She's a geologist studying the rock formations on Dead Man's Ridge." Tanner was saved from responding by the arrival of Emily, punctual to the minute. True to her word, she was wearing another bright yellow jacket, though today it was paired with sturdy hiking pants and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. "Right. On time," Tanner greeted her, oddly pleased by her punctuality. In his experience, academics tended to operate on their own schedule, often running late. "I've been looking forward to this," Emily admitted, adjusting her small backpack. "After going through my photos from last week, I'm more convinced than ever that there's something significant happening in these rock formations." "Well, I've planned a route that should give you plenty to work with," Tanner said, spreading a topographical map on the counter. "Eagle's Cleft has similar rock composition to Dead Man's Ridge, but with better trails and more stable footing. And," he added, "with a meaningful look, it's much easier to evacuate if another storm rolls in." Emily laughed. "Lesson learned. I checked the forecast 3 times before driving up. Clear skies all day." They set off shortly after, taking Tanner's truck to a trailhead about 20 minutes from the station. The path to Eagle's Cleft was moderately challenging, enough to require attention, but not so difficult as to be inaccessible to a skilled hiker, regardless of stature. As they walked, Tanner found himself adjusting his pace not out of necessity, but out of courtesy. Emily moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent years adapting to a world built for taller people, and she kept up without difficulty. "You mentioned you've been hiking since you were 12, Tanner said as they paused at a stream crossing. "That's pretty young to start serious mountain trails." Emily balanced carefully on a stepping stone before answering. "My parents were determined I wouldn't be limited by my dwarfism. They enrolled me in every physical activity imaginable. Swimming, gymnastics, rock climbing. Hiking was the one that stuck." "They sound like good parents." "The best," she agreed, successfully reaching the other side, though their enthusiasm sometimes bordered on pushing too hard. "I think they were terrified I'd use my condition as an excuse to avoid challenges." Tanner crossed the stream, and they continued along the trail, which was now climbing steadily through a stand of old-growth hemlocks. "Did you use it as an excuse?" "I mean," Emily shot him a sidelong glance, "only when I didn't want to do the dishes." The morning passed pleasantly as they made their way to Eagle's Cleft. Every so often, Emily would stop to examine a rock formation or take a sample, carefully labeling each one and making notes in a small waterproof notebook. Tanner found her methodical approach fascinating, and he enjoyed watching the way her face lit up when she found something particularly interesting. By midday, they had reached their destination, a dramatic split in a cliff face that revealed layers of rock strata. Like pages in a book, Emily stood before it in silent appreciation before gunslinging her pack and pulling out a more sophisticated camera than the one she'd had with her during the storm. "This is perfect," she breathed, already snapping photos from different angles. "Look at the displacement in these layers. And these stress fractures, they're exactly the kind of evidence I was hoping to find." Tanner hung back, allowing her the space to work. There was something captivating about watching someone completely in their element, someone whose passion translated into a kind of grace. Emily moved with purpose, her smaller stature seemingly forgotten as she navigated the rocky terrain with practiced ease. After about an hour of intensive documentation, they settled on a flat outcropping for lunch. Tanner had packed sandwiches, and Emily contributed a bag of trail mix and 2 apples. "So," Emily said between bites, "what's your favorite spot in the park? The place you go when you're not on duty?" Tanner considered the question thoughtfully. "There's a small lake about 3 miles north of here. It doesn't have a name on any official maps. Most people don't know it exists because the trail that used to lead there was washed out years ago. I call it Tyler's Lake." Emily's expression softened at the mention of the name. She remembered his story about his son from their conversation in the cave. "How do you get there?" "Game trails mostly. It's not an easy hike, but it's worth it. The water is so clear you can see straight to the bottom, even at the center, and it's perfectly still most mornings, like a mirror reflecting the sky. It sounds beautiful," Emily said quietly. "It is." Tanner paused, surprising himself with what he was about to offer. "Maybe I could show you sometime, if you're interested in more than just rocks." A smile spread slowly across Emily's face. "I'd like that. I'm quite interested in more than just rocks." The moment stretched between them, comfortable yet charged with possibility. Tanner found himself noticing details he hadn't before. The splash of freckles across Emily's nose, the way one corner of her mouth lifted slightly higher than the other when she smiled. The spell was broken by the distant sound of voices, other hikers approaching along the main trail. Emily turned her attention back to her sandwich, and Tanner checked his watch. "We should probably start heading back soon, if you want to catch the last shuttle to Millfield," he said, reluctantly acknowledging the constraints of time. Emily nodded, brushing crumbs from her lap. "Just let me take a few more photos before we go. The light is perfect right now." As she returned to her documentation, Tanner cleaned up their lunch spot, carefully packing away the remnants. He was just closing his backpack when Emily called out excitedly, "Tanner, come look at this!" He crossed to where she was kneeling beside a section of exposed bedrock. "What did you find? See these?" She pointed to a series of faint parallel lines, etched into the stone. "These are slicken sides, polished surfaces created when 2 rock masses slide past each other during a fault movement. This is definitive evidence of seismic activity." Tanner crouched beside her, genuinely impressed. "So your theory about an undocumented fault line is looking more and more likely," she finished, beaming up at him. "With this and the samples from Deadman's Ridge, I might have enough to convince Professor Lawrence to fund a proper expedition." "That's fantastic," Tanner said, sharing in her excitement. "Though I have to admit, I'm a little concerned about what this means for the park if there's an active fault line running through it." Emily's expression grew more serious. "That's exactly why this research matters. If there is an active fault, here people need to know, especially since the area is becoming more developed every year." "True enough," Tanner agreed, thinking of the new vacation homes being built just outside the park boundaries. Safety first, they began their descent, back toward the trailhead, both in good spirits despite the physical exertion of the day. As they walked, their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from favorite books to the most challenging hikes they'd ever attempted. "So," Emily said as they approached the final stretch of trail, "same time next weekend? There are a few more sites I'd like to check if you're willing to be my guide again." Tanner hesitated, and Emily picked up on it immediately. "Unless you're busy, of course," she added quickly. "I don't want to impose on your free time." "It's not that," Tanner assured her. "It's just, next Saturday is the anniversary of Tyler's accident. I usually spend it alone, up at the lake." "Oh." Emily's face softened with understanding. "Of course, I completely understand." They walked in silence for a moment, before Tanner spoke again, his voice quieter than before. "You know, I've never taken anyone else up there. Not my ex-wife, not my colleagues. It's been my private place to remember him. Emily nodded, respecting the significance of what he was saying. But, Tanner continued, surprising himself, I think Tyler would have liked you. He was fascinated by science, wanted to be a marine biologist. And he would have appreciated your determination, how you don't let anything stop you from pursuing what matters to you. He took a deep breath before continuing. If you're interested, I'd like to show you Tyler's lake. Not just as a guide, but as a friend. The word seemed inadequate somehow, but it was all he could offer at the moment. Emily's response was simple, but genuine. I would be honored, Tanner. Truly. As they reached the truck, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the trees. The day had been productive for Emily's research, but Tanner suspected they'd both found something more valuable than geological evidence. An unexpected connection that had begun with a misunderstanding on a foggy ridge. The drive back to the ranger station was companionable, filled with comfortable silences and easy conversation. When they arrived, Emily transferred her samples and equipment to her own vehicle, a practical, slightly modified SUV that accommodated her need to reach the pedals without sacrificing storage space. So, next Saturday? She confirmed, standing beside her car. Next Saturday, Tanner agreed. But this time, let's meet at my cabin. The trail to the lake starts from there. I'll text you the directions. After exchanging phone numbers, they said their goodbyes, both aware that something significant had shifted between them. What had begun as an embarrassing rescue attempt had evolved into a connection neither of them had been looking for, but both now valued. As Tanner watched Emily drive away, he felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. For so long, his life had been defined by loss, the loss of his son, his marriage, his former career. But standing there in the fading light, he realized he might be on the verge of finding something new, and for the first time in a very long time, he was eager to discover where this unexpected path might lead. The week passed slowly for Tanner. Each day on patrol seemed longer than usual as his thoughts repeatedly drifted to the upcoming Saturday. Twice, Diane had to radio him when he failed to check in at his scheduled times, something that had never happened before in his 7 years as a ranger. You're distracted, she observed on Friday afternoon as they went over the weekend shift rotations. It's not like you, Tanner shrugged, not meeting her eyes. Just thinking about tomorrow. The anniversary, Diane said softly. She was one of the few people who knew the significance of the date. Are you still planning to go up to the lake? Yes. He hesitated before adding, but I won't be alone this time. Diane's eyebrows rose in surprise, but to her credit she didn't push for details. Well, the weather's supposed to be perfect. Clear skies, mid-60s. Thanks. Tanner appreciated her restraint. He wasn't ready to explain his invitation to Emily, wasn't sure he could articulate his reasons, even to himself. That evening, as he prepared his cabin for a visitor, something he hadn't done in years, Tanner found himself both anxious and strangely hopeful. He swept the porch, cleared away the stack of worn paperbacks that had accumulated beside his armchair, and even changed the sheets in the spare bedroom, just in case the hike took longer than expected and Emily needed to stay overnight. Tito. Latter task gave him pause. Was he presuming too much? Emily had never mentioned staying, and the hike, while strenuous, was certainly doable as a day trip. But mountain weather was unpredictable, and it seemed prudent to be prepared. His phone chimed with a text message. Still on for tomorrow? Need me to bring anything? Tanner smiled at Emily's thoughtfulness. All set. Just good hiking boots and your usual gear. Lunch is covered. After a moment's hesitation, he added, looking forward to it? Her reply came almost immediately, me too. See you at 9 Saturday, dawn clear and cool, with the promise of warmth as the sun rose higher. Tanner was up before first light, brewing coffee and packing supplies for their journey, along with the practical necessities: first aid kit, water, purification tablets, emergency blanket. He included a small stone urn that normally sat on his mantelpiece. Every year on this day, he carried a portion of Tyler's ashes to the lake, scattering them on the water in a private ritual of remembrance. He hadn't mentioned this part to Emily and wasn't sure if he would go through with it with her present. But having the urn with him provided a sense of comfort, a tangible connection to his son. At precisely 9 o'clock, the sound of tires on gravel announced Emily's arrival. Tanner stepped onto the porch as her SUV pulled up beside his truck. She emerged with a bright smile, dressed in hiking clothes, with her yellow jacket tied around her waist. "Morning," she called, retrieving her backpack from the passenger seat. "Your directions were perfect. I didn't get lost once." "It's pretty straightforward once you know where to turn," Tanner replied, coming down the steps to meet her. "Coffee? Before we head out, please?" I started early to avoid traffic. Inside the cabin, Emily glanced around with undisguised curiosity. The space was simple but comfortable. A large main room that served as both living room and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. Bookshelves lined another, filled with an eclectic mix of nature guides, crime novels, and philosophy. "Texts. Nice place," she commented, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. "Very you." "What makes it very me?" Tanner asked, genuinely curious about her perception. Emily took a sip before answering. "Practical but not austere, comfortable without being fussy, and," she added with a nod toward the bookshelves, "full of unexpected depth." Tanner felt an odd warmth at her assessment. High praise from someone who's known me less than 2 weeks. "I'm a scientist," she replied with a hint of mischief. "Observation is my specialty." They finished their coffee amid easy conversation, then shouldered their packs and set off along a narrow trail that began just behind Tanner's cabin. Unlike the maintained paths in the park, this route was barely discernible in places, marked occasionally by small cairns that Tanner had built over the years. "The old trail was destroyed in a landslide about a decade ago," he explained, as they picked their way through a boulder field. "The Park Service decided not to rebuild it, since there are other more accessible lakes in the area." "Their loss," Emily remarked, carefully testing a rock before putting her weight on it. "Though I have to admit, I appreciate the solitude. The main trails can get pretty crowded in summer." The terrain grew steadily more challenging as they ascended. What had once been a gradual slope became steeper, requiring them to use their hands in some places to pull themselves up. Tanner kept a careful eye on Emily, ready to offer assistance if needed, but she navigated the difficulties with practiced ease. At one particularly steep section, she paused, studying the rock face with a professional eye. "Interesting stratification. Here, looks like there was significant uplift at some point." Tanner had climbed this route dozens of times, but had never really noticed the geological features. "More evidence for your fault line theory?" "Possibly." She ran her hand along a visible seam in the rock. "It's definitely consistent with the patterns I've been documenting. I wish I'd brought my sampling kit." "We can come back," Tanner offered, "without thinking." Another day when science is the primary objective. Emily glanced up at him, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I'd like that." The simple exchange held a promise of future outings, a continuation of whatever was developing between them. Neither felt the need to define it further as they resumed their climb. After about 2 hours of hiking, they reached a ridge that offered the first glimpse of their destination. Below them, nestled in a natural bowl formed by the surrounding peaks, lay a small, perfectly round lake. Its surface reflected the blue sky and white clouds like a flawless mirror. "Oh," Emily breathed, the single syllable conveying her awe better than any elaborate praise. Tanner stood beside her, seeing the lake through her eyes and rediscovering its beauty. Worth the climb? Absolutely. The final descent to the shoreline was relatively easy, following a gently sloping game trail through a stand of subalpine fir. As they emerged from the trees, the full panorama of the lake opened before them, a pristine circle of water perhaps a quarter-mile across, surrounded by a narrow band of grassy shore before the forest reclaimed the land. "It's perfect," Emily said softly, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. "I can see why this is your special place." Tanner nodded, his throat suddenly tight with emotion. He led the way to a flat rock near the water's edge, his usual spot for reflection. Emily followed, seeming to intuit his need for a moment of silence. They sat side by side, listening to the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. After a while, Tanner reached into his pack and withdrew the small stone urn. "Tyler loved this lake," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "We found it by accident during a backpacking trip when he was 14. Got lost in a fog and stumbled down that same ridge we just climbed." Emily remained quiet, giving him space to continue at his own pace. "We came back every summer after that, made it our tradition." Tanner turned the urn in his hands, fingers tracing the smooth surface. "After the accident, I couldn't bear the thought of scattering all his ashes at once. It felt too final, so I keep most of them at home. But each year on this day, I bring a small portion here." Emily's expression was gentle with understanding. "Would you like me to give you some privacy?" Tanner considered her offer, appreciating her sensitivity, but something in him needed to share this moment. "Stay," he said simply, "if you don't mind." "I don't mind." With careful movements, Tanner opened the urn and approached the water's edge. The lake was calm, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple when a fish rose to catch an insect. He knelt and gently released a small amount of ashes onto the water. "Hey, kiddo," he whispered, too quietly for Emily to hear. "I brought someone to meet you today. I think you'd approve." The ashes swirled briefly before dispersing, becoming one with the lake that had brought father and son so much joy. Tanner remained kneeling for a long moment, eyes closed, before returning to where Emily waited. "Thank you," he said as he sat beside her again, "for being here." Emily's hand found his small fingers interlacing with his larger ones in a gesture of simple comfort. "Thank you for sharing this with me. It means a lot." They sat in companionable silence, hands linked until the sun reached its zenith. Finally, Tanner gave her fingers a gentle squeeze before releasing them to reach for his. "Pack! Hungry?" he asked, his voice returning to its normal timbre. "Starving," Emily admitted with a smile. Tanner unpacked their lunch, sandwiches more elaborate than their previous trail fare, a container of mixed berries and 2 slices of homemade apple pie carefully wrapped in wax paper. "You made pie." Emily's eyes widened in appreciation. "Don't sound so surprised," Tanner said with mock indignation. "I do have some skills beyond mountain rescue and misidentifying geologists." She laughed, the sound echoing across the water. "Consider me impressed, Ranger Coleman." They ate with the hearty appetite that comes from physical exertion in mountain air, conversation flowing more easily now that the emotional weight of the memorial had lifted. Emily shared stories of her academic struggles, the skepticism she'd faced not just because of her unconventional theories, but because of assumptions made about her capabilities due to her dwarfism. "The worst part is when they try to be helpful," she said, finishing the last bite of her pie, "offering to carry my equipment or suggesting I stick to less demanding research areas, as if geology from a desk is even possible." "People mean..." "Well," Tanner offered, though he understood her frustration, Most do, Emily acknowledged, but meaning well doesn't make it any less patronizing. That's why I appreciate how you've treated me from the start, after the initial misunderstanding. Of course. Tanner raised an eyebrow. You mean after I mistook you for a lost child and attempted a heroic rescue? Exactly, she grinned. Once we got past that, you never once suggested I couldn't handle the terrain or offered unnecessary help. Do you know how rare that is? I've seen you on the trails, Tanner said simply. You move better than most of the hikers I encounter, regardless of size. Her smile softened at the genuine compliment. Thank you for seeing that. After lunch, they explored the circumference of the lake, Tanner pointing out the spots where he and Tyler had camped or fished or simply sat talking about life. Each location held a memory, and sharing them aloud felt like introducing his son to Emily in the only way possible. As they completed their circuit and returned to their original spot, Emily stooped to pick up a small, flat stone. With practiced motion, she sent it skipping across the water's surface. 1, 2, 3, 4 bounces before it sank. Not bad, Tanner commented. Tyler's record? She asked, somehow knowing this would have been a competition between father and son. 11, Tanner said with a proud smile. He had a knack for finding the perfect stones. Emily searched the shoreline before selecting another candidate. This one managed 6 skips, earning an approving nod from Tanner. They continued the impromptu game, laughing when their throws went awry and cheering particularly successful attempts. In the midst of their stone-skipping competition, Tanner realized he was enjoying himself, truly enjoying himself, on a day that had been solely dedicated to grief for the past 7 years. The recognition brought a momentary pang of guilt that must have shown on his face. What is it? Emily asked, noticing the change in his expression. Tanner hesitated before answering honestly. I just realized I'm having fun. It feels strange on today of all days. Emily's response was gentle but firm. Do you think Tyler would want this day to be only about sadness? The question caught him off guard. No, he admitted after a moment's reflection. He'd probably be rolling his eyes at me for being so somber all these years. He was a happy kid, liked to laugh, to make others laugh. Then I think he'd approve of stone-skipping competitions and pie by the lake, Emily said, handing him a particularly promising flat stone. Even on the anniversary, Tanner accepted the stone, turning it over in his palm before sending it dancing across the water in a series of perfect bounces. 8 in total, his best of the day. I think you're right, he said, a weight lifting from his shoulders that he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. The afternoon passed with an ease that seemed to suspend time. They took turns reading aloud from a small volume of Mary Oliver poems that Emily had brought along, argued good-naturedly about the best route for climbing one of the nearby peaks, and eventually fell into a comfortable silence, sitting shoulder to shoulder as the sun began its descent toward the western ridgeline. We should probably start heading back, Tanner said reluctantly, checking his watch. It's a bit trickier navigating this trail in fading light. Emily nodded, though she made no immediate move to pack up. This has been special, Tanner. I'm honored you shared it with me. The sincerity in her voice touched him deeply. I'm glad you were here. As they prepared to leave, Tanner found himself unexpectedly relaxed about departing. In previous years, saying goodbye to the lake had been wrenching, a symbolic re-separation from Tyler that left him melancholy for days afterward. Today, while still tinged with sadness, the farewell felt different, more like turning a page than closing a book. The hike back was largely downhill, but required careful attention as shadows lengthened across the trail. They moved at a steady pace, with Tanner occasionally pointing out landmarks to help Emily navigate the less obvious sections. By the time they reached the cabin, twilight had deepened into early evening. The temperature had dropped noticeably, bringing with it the crisp scent of pine and approaching autumn. "Would you like to come in for a while?" Tanner offered as they reached his porch. "Coffee? Something stronger?" Emily glanced at her watch. Clearly torn. "I should probably start back. It's a long drive to Millfield and I have early classes on Monday." "Of course," Tanner said, masking his disappointment. "Another time." She hesitated, then surprised him by asking, "What are your plans for Thanksgiving?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "Thanksgiving? I usually work the holiday shifts at the park. Let the rangers with families have the time off. Would you consider a change in tradition this year?" Emily looked up at him, a spark of something like hope in her eyes. "I host a small gathering for colleagues and friends who don't have family nearby. Nothing fancy, but good food, good conversation." Tanner found himself unexpectedly moved by the invitation, so casual in delivery, yet profound in what it represented. A connection extending beyond their mountain encounters, an integration into the other aspects of her life. "I'd like that," he said, the simple words inadequate to express what he was feeling. Emily's smile held the same warmth it had when she'd seen the lake for the first time. "Good. That's settled then." As she turned to go, Tanner was struck by an impulse he didn't try to resist. "Emily," she looked back, eyebrows raised in question. "There's a meteor shower next weekend, supposed to be spectacular. The view from up here is pretty amazing if you're interested." "Another scientific expedition?" she asked, eyes twinkling with amusement. Tanner shook his head, finding the courage to be direct. "No, just a date, if you want it to be." The word hung between them, transforming the moment into something new and full of possibility. Emily's response was equally direct. "I'd like that very much." The simplicity of their exchange belied the significance of the step they were taking, acknowledging that what had begun with a mistaken rescue attempt had evolved into something neither had anticipated, but both now welcomed. As Emily drove away, headlights illuminating the darkening forest road, Tanner remained on his porch, watching until the lights disappeared around a bend. For the first time in years, the anniversary of his greatest loss had also become the beginning of something new, not a replacement for what was gone, but a different kind of joy that could exist alongside the enduring grief. He looked up at the emerging stars, feeling a profound sense of peace. "Thanks, kiddo," he whispered to the night sky, knowing somehow that Tyler would understand everything that simple phrase encompassed. Inside the cabin, Tanner noticed Emily had left her book of Mary Oliver poems on the table. Whether forgotten, accidentally, or left as an excuse to return, it brought a smile to his face. He opened it to find a page marked with a small pressed flower and read the highlighted lines. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" The question resonated deeply as Tanner realized he was, at long last, ready to answer it anew. The meteor shower date marked a turning point. What followed was an autumn of discovery, not just of the potential fault line that increasingly fascinated Emily, but of each other. Weekends became sacred time, with Emily driving up from Millfield on Friday evenings to spend Saturday and Sunday in the mountains before returning to her university obligations. By late October, Tanner had grown accustomed to the sound of her SUV coming up his driveway, to making coffee for 2 in the mornings, to the way she curled up in his armchair with one of his books while he prepared dinner. They fell into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural for two people who had spent so many years defining themselves by their independence. "I've been thinking," Emily said one Sunday evening as they sat on his porch watching the sunset paint. The mountains in shades of gold and pink. She was bundled in one of Tanner's flannel shirts, which hung comically large on her small frame, but provided perfect warmth against the autumn chill. "Dangerous pastime," Tanner quipped, earning a gentle elbow to his ribs. "I'm serious," she continued. Through her eyes held amusement. Professor Lawrence still isn't convinced about my fault line theory, but the evidence we've gathered over the past 2 months is substantial. I'm going to apply for an external research grant. Tanner nodded his approval. They had spent several weekends visiting various sites throughout the park, with Emily meticulously documenting geological formations, while Tanner ensured they had safe access to the more remote areas. The deadline is next month, she added. If approved, I could start a comprehensive survey in the spring. It would mean more time up here, possibly with a small research team. That sounds promising, Tanner said, though he found himself unexpectedly ambivalent about the prospect of sharing their mountain explorations with others. Emily seemed to read his thoughts. The team would focus on the eastern quadrant. We'd still have our weekends. Tanner smiled, relieved and a little embarrassed at being so transparent. When will you know about the grant? January, most likely. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that had become familiar and cherished. Until then, I'll just have to rely on my friendly neighborhood ranger for access to all the good spots. I think that can be arranged, Dr. Mackenzie, he replied, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. The following Friday, Tanner was surprised when Emily didn't arrive at her usual time. A text message explained she was running late. A department meeting had gone longer than expected, but she was on her way. He busied himself with chores around the cabin, checking his phone periodically as the evening deepened into night. When she finally pulled up just after 10, Tanner knew immediately something was wrong. Emily's normally animated face was drawn, her movements stiff as she retrieved her bag from the car. What happened? He asked as she climbed the porch steps. Professor Lawrence happened, she replied, the weariness in her voice masking a deeper anger. He rejected my preliminary findings, said they were inconclusive at best, imaginary at worst, then suggested I focus on more appropriate research opportunities. Tanner held the door open, frowning. What does that mean? It means he thinks I should stick to lab work rather than field research. Emily's voice took on a mocking tone. Field geology can be quite demanding physically, Dr. Mackenzie. Perhaps your talents would be better utilized in analysis rather than collection. She dropped her bag by the door with more force than necessary. 7 years I've been proving myself in that department, and he still thinks I can't handle field work because of my size. That's ridiculous, Tanner said, genuine outrage rising on her behalf. You've navigated terrain that gives experienced hikers trouble. Exactly. Emily paced the small confines of the living room, her frustration palpable. But Lawrence has never seen me in the field. He just assumes I'm incapable because of how I look. Tanner let her vent, understanding her. Need to process the frustration before he offered any suggestions. Only when she finally sank into the armchair, emotional exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders, did he speak. What about the external grant? Can you still apply? Emily nodded. That's my plan, but Lawrence's support would have strengthened the application considerably. Without it, she trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. So we need to convince him, Tanner said simply. Emily looked up, a hint of her usual spark returning to her eyes. We? Partners in geological crime, remember? He reminded her with a smile. Besides, I've got a vested interest in this fault. Line 2, it's my park that might be sitting in a potential earthquake zone. The spark in Emily's eyes brightened. I have been thinking about an approach that might work, but it would require some unconventional cooperation from the park service. Tanner leaned forward, intrigued. I'm listening. By midnight, they had formulated a plan that was either brilliant or completely foolhardy. Invite Professor Lawrence and the department's grant committee to a site visit, arranged and guided by Ranger Coleman, the park's most experienced wilderness guide. They would bring the skeptical academics to the most compelling evidence sites, letting the geology speak for itself. Lawrence can dismiss my reports and photographs, Emily said. excitement replacing her earlier despondency. But he can't ignore what's right in front of him. And having an official park ranger validate the locations will add credibility. And if they see you navigate the terrain yourself, that undermines his concerns about your field capabilities, Tanner added. Exactly. Emily's face glowed with renewed determination. Lawrence actually respects you, not you specifically, but the authority of park rangers. He's written extensively about the importance of conservation officers in environmental protection. Tanner grimaced. So I need to be extra official. Badges, uniforms, the works. The full ranger mystique, Emily confirmed with a grin. Think. You can handle it. For you, absolutely. The simple truth of those two words hung in the air between them, acknowledging without elaboration the depth of commitment that had grown over the autumn months. The following morning, Tanner called Diane to float the idea of an official geological survey with university participation. To his relief, she was immediately supportive. It's perfect timing, actually, she said. The director has been pushing for more academic partnerships. This could be a pilot program. With park administration on board, Emily crafted a formal invitation to Professor Lawrence and the grant committee, emphasizing the Park Service's interest in the potential fault line and their request for Western State University's expertise. The phrasing was carefully constructed to appeal to Lawrence's ego while making it difficult for him to decline what appeared to be an official request. The response came faster than either of them expected. Lawrence not only accepted, but expressed enthusiastic support for the collaborative initiative between Western State and Evergreen Ridge National Park. He and 3 committee members would be available the following weekend for a guided field survey. He completely bought it. Emily marveled, reading the email aloud to Tanner over the phone. And listen to this. We look forward to Ranger Coleman's expert guidance and appreciate the Park Service's recognition of our department's geological expertise. Tanner chuckled at the irony. Little does he know the expert guidance is based entirely on your research, a minor detail, Emily replied, her tone light with suppressed laughter. What matters is he's coming, and he's bringing the people who can approve my grant application. The week leading up to the site visit was a flurry of preparation. Tanner arranged for an official park vehicle to transport the academics, reviewed topographical maps to plan the most efficient route between evidence sites, and made sure his ranger uniform was impeccably pressed. Emily compiled a comprehensive field guide for each participant, containing her preliminary findings presented as background information from the Park Service. When the day arrived, Tanner met Emily at the ranger station an hour before the academics were due to arrive. She was dressed in professional field gear, sturdy hiking pants, a tailored jacket with the Western State University emblem, and her signature yellow outer shell ready in her pack in case of inclement weather. Nervous? He asked, noting the way she rechecked her equipment for the 3rd time. Terrified, she admitted with a small smile. 3 years of research riding on one day. Tanner placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The evidence is solid. You've done the work. Now we just need to get Lawrence to the right places and let him see it for himself. Diane poked her head out of her office. They're here. Black SUV just pulled into the lot. Emily took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Showtime. Professor Lawrence was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and the slightly stooped posture of someone who had spent decades bent over rock samples and microscopes. He was accompanied by 3 colleagues, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in what appeared to be brand-new hiking gear. Professor Lawrence, Emily greeted him with professional courtesy. Thank you for coming. May I introduce Ranger Tanner Coleman, who will be guiding our survey today. Tanner stepped forward, the very picture of ranger authority in his official uniform and wide-brimmed hat. Welcome to Evergreen Ridge, Professor. We appreciate your department's willingness to lend its expertise to this matter. Lawrence shook his hand firmly. The pleasure is ours, Ranger Coleman. It's not often we get specifically requested by the Park Service. He glanced at Emily with what seemed like genuine surprise. And I understand we have Dr. Mackenzie to thank for facilitating this collaboration. Emily managed a modest nod. I simply mentioned the unusual formations to Ranger Coleman during one of my weekend hikes. He recognized their potential significance immediately. Tanner suppressed a smile at this creative rewriting of history. Dr. Mackenzie has been most helpful in identifying sites of interest. Shall we get started? We have quite a full itinerary ahead of us. The first stop on their tour was the least challenging physically. A road cut along the park's eastern access road that clearly showed displaced strata layers. As the academics examined the exposed rock face, Tanner stood back, allowing Emily to explain the significance of what they were seeing. Note the offset between these two layers, she pointed out, her expertise evident in every word. This type of displacement is consistent with fault movement. What makes it particularly interesting is that it doesn't align with the documented fault systems in the region. Lawrence rubbed his chin thoughtfully, peering at the formation through a magnifying lens he'd pulled from his pocket. It is anomalous. Could be localized slumping or erosion effects, though. That was my initial thought as well, Emily replied smoothly. But when we examine it in context with the other sites, a pattern emerges that's difficult to explain. Through isolated events. The next location required a moderate hike up a winding trail to a cliff face that displayed striking slicken sides, the polished, striated surfaces created when rock masses slide past each other during seismic activity. Getting there involved navigating several steep sections where the trail narrowed considerably. Tanner watched with quiet pride as Emily moved confidently along the path, pausing occasionally to ensure the less sure-footed academics were managing. The terrain. Lawrence, despite his initial skepticism, seemed genuinely impressed both by the geological features Emily pointed out and by her evident comfort in the field environment. These striations are remarkably well defined, the female committee member commented, running her fingers along the polished surface. And you say you've documented similar features at multiple sites throughout the park? 17 locations. So far, Emily confirmed, all showing consistent directional orientation that suggests a previously unidentified fault line running northeast to southwest through this section of the Cascades. The afternoon's final destination was the most challenging, Eagles Cleft, where Emily had first discovered the compelling evidence that had prompted her research. The trail there was rugged, with several sections requiring careful attention to footing and balance. About halfway up, Professor Lawrence began to struggle, his breathing labored as he paused frequently to rest. The other committee members weren't. Faring much better, their city-trained bodies unused to the demands of mountain terrain. Perhaps we should consider turning back, one of the male professors suggested, eyeing the steep trail ahead with apprehension. We've seen quite convincing evidence already. Lawrence shook his head stubbornly. No. If Dr. Mackenzie believes the most compelling formations are at this Eagle's Cleft, then that's what we need to see. He glanced at Emily with newfound respect. Though I must say, Mackenzie, I had no idea you were so adept in these conditions. Emily bit back a smile. Years of practice, Professor. The geology doesn't always make itself accessible in convenient locations. When they finally reached Eagle's Cleft, the academics' discomfort was forgotten in the face of the dramatic geological evidence before them. The exposed rock face told a clear story of seismic activity, displaced layers, stress fractures, and mineral alterations that could only be explained by fault movement. This is remarkable, Lawrence admitted, all skepticism gone from his voice. The pattern is undeniable when seen in person, and you've mapped this across the entire eastern quadrant of the park? Emily nodded, trying to contain her excitement at his change in tone. The preliminary mapping is complete, but a comprehensive survey would require additional resources. That's why I've proposed the research grant, to fund a thorough documentation of the fault line and assess its seismic potential. The female committee member was examining Emily's field notes with growing interest. These observations are meticulous, and the implications for regional seismic risk assessment are significant. Exactly, Tanner interjected, playing his part. That's why the Park Service is eager to support a full investigation. Public safety is our primary concern. Lawrence straightened up, wincing slightly as his back protested the day's exertion. Well, I believe I speak for the entire committee when I say that Western State University would be proud to partner with Evergreen Ridge National Park on this research. He turned to Emily, extending his hand. And Dr. Mackenzie, it appears I owe you an apology for underestimating both the merit of your theory and your capability for field research. Emily accepted his handshake with professional grace, though Tanner could see the triumph shining in her eyes. Thank you, Professor. I appreciate your reconsidering both assessments. As they began their descent back to the trailhead, Lawrence fell into step beside Emily, asking detailed questions about her methodology and findings. The transformation from dismissive skeptic to engaged colleague was remarkable to witness. By the time they returned to the ranger station, exhausted but satisfied, the outcome was clear. The grant committee was unanimously supportive of Emily's research proposal, with Lawrence himself offering to write a strong letter of endorsement. It's not often I'm proven wrong so thoroughly, he admitted as they said their goodbyes. But in this case, I'm quite pleased to be corrected. This could be groundbreaking work, Dr. Mackenzie. After the academics departed, Emily maintained her professional composure until they were out of sight. Then she turned to Tanner with a squeal of delight and threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking his ranger hat off in the process. "We did it!" she exclaimed, her face radiant with joy. Did you see Lawrence's face when he realized he couldn't dismiss the evidence, and when he apologized for underestimating me? I wish I'd recorded that moment for posterity. Tanner laughed, lifting her in a celebratory spin that drew an amused glance from Diane as she passed by. You were brilliant out there, professional, authoritative, and you handled that terrain like you were born on it. We make a good team, Emily said as he set her back on her feet, her hands still resting on his shoulders. The distinguished ranger and the determined geologist. Sounds like the title of a very boring adventure novel, Tanner jokes. Or a very interesting love story, Emily replied softly, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, not caring who might see. Later that evening, after they'd celebrated with dinner at the Broken Antler, where Mac had insisted on champagne on the house after hearing about Emily's triumph, they sat on Tanner's porch swing, watching stars emerge in the clear autumn sky. So, Tanner said, his arm around her shoulders, full geological survey in the spring. What does that mean for you? Emily nestled closer against his side. 6 months of field work, most likely. Data collection, mapping, analysis. Based here? The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. That would be the most practical approach, she agreed, though it would mean a lot of driving back and forth to campus for my teaching obligations. Tanner was quiet for a moment, considering a thought that had been forming in his mind over the past few weeks. What if you didn't have to drive back and forth so much? Emily shifted to look up at his face. What do you mean? I mean, Tanner took a breath, surprising himself with how certain he felt about what he was about to propose. What if you based yourself here, not just for weekends, not just for the research period? Emily's eyes widened as she understood the implication. Tanner Coleman, are you asking me to move in with you? I am, he confirmed, suddenly nervous despite the closeness they'd developed. I know it hasn't been that long, and it's a big step. But these past few months have been the happiest I've known in years. When you're here, this place feels more like home than it ever has." Emily was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "My lease in Millfield is up in December," she said finally, "and I've never been particularly attached to that apartment." Hope rose in Tanner's chest. "Is that a yes?" We should discuss the practical details," Emily replied, though her smile belied the caution in her words. "Like the fact that most of your kitchen cabinets are out of my reach, and your shower would need adjusting. All fixable," Tanner said quickly. "I'm pretty handy with renovations." Emily laughed, the sound warm in the cool night air. "I know you are. And yes, Tanner, it's a yes, though I warn you, I come with a lot of books and rock samples." "I wouldn't have it any other way," he said, pulling her close. As they sat together planning logistics and dreaming of the future, Tanner marveled at how much his life had changed since that foggy morning on Dead Man's Ridge. What had begun as an embarrassing case of mistaken identity had led to the most meaningful connection he'd found since losing Tyler. The mountains that had once been his solitary refuge were now the foundation of something new, a partnership as solid and enduring as the ancient rocks beneath them, with fault lines that didn't weaken but revealed greater depths when properly understood. Winter descended on the Cascades with its usual dramatic flair, heavy snowfalls that transformed the rugged landscape into a pristine wonderland, temperatures that plunged well below freezing, and winds that howled around the eaves of Tanner's cabin like restless spirits. But inside, warmth prevailed, both literally from the crackling wood stove and figuratively from the life now taking shape within those walls. Moving Emily's belongings from Millfield had been a logistical challenge tackled over several December weekends. Tanner's prediction that she would bring a lot of books and rock samples proved to be a spectacular understatement. Her collection of geological texts alone filled the better part of his truck bed, not to mention the carefully labeled specimens that required special crates to transport safely. "I might have a slight hoarding problem when it comes to academic materials," Emily admitted, as they unloaded what seemed like the 100th box of books. "You think?" Tanner teased, setting the heavy container down with an exaggerated groan. "And here I thought geologists were all about reducing things to their essential elements." Emily flicked a snowflake from his nose. "That's chemists. Geologists are all about layers and accumulation." By mid-December, the cabin had transformed into a space that belonged to both of them. Tanner had spent evenings and his days off making the modifications they discussed. Lowering key cabinet shelves, installing a custom step system in the kitchen, and adjusting the shower controls to be within Emily's comfortable reach. She, in turn, had integrated her books with his, created a small office area in the spare bedroom, and added touches that softened the cabin's previously utilitarian atmosphere. The grant approval came 2 days before Christmas, the official letter, arriving by mail rather than email, a formality that gave the moment a certain gravitas as they stood together at the kitchen counter to read it. "We are pleased to inform Dr. Emily Mackenzie that her research proposal, identification and assessment of an undocumented fault system in the Cascade Range, has been approved for full funding." Emily's voice grew increasingly excited as she continued reading. "Full funding, Tanner. Not partial, not provisional, full." He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "Was there ever any doubt? After Lawrence's change of heart, it was a sure thing." "Nothing's ever sure in academia," Emily replied, though her smile didn't falter. "This means I can hire 2 research assistants, get all the equipment we need, and secure dedicated lab time for analysis." She turned in his arms, eyes bright with plans and possibilities. "It's really happening." Tanner kissed her forehead. "I never doubted it would, not for a minute." Christmas was a quiet affair by mutual agreement. Neither of them had celebrated properly in years. Tanner because the holiday had been Tyler's favorite, too painful to observe in the years following his death. Emily because her parents had retired to Florida, and the journey was rarely worth the inevitable tensions that arose during their visits. Instead, they created new traditions. A small tree decorated with ornaments collected from the park gift shop, gifts that were thoughtful rather than extravagant, and a Christmas Eve hike to a viewpoint that overlooked the valley, where they toasted the holiday with hot chocolate laced with peppermint schnapps. New Year's Eve brought an unexpected snowstorm that knocked out power across the region. They welcomed 2025 by candlelight, huddled under blankets as the wind rattled the windows and transformed the world outside into a swirling white void. Not exactly the glamorous celebration most people are having, Tanner observed, as he added another log to the wood stove. Emily looked up from the geological journal she was reading by candlelight. Are you kidding? This is perfect. No crowds, no noise, no ridiculous expectations. Just us and the mountains doing what mountains do. Tanner settled beside her on the couch, never ceasing to be amazed by how perfectly their perspectives aligned on matters both large and small. Happy New Year, Dr. Mackenzie. Happy New Year, Ranger Coleman. She set aside her journal to curl against him. Here's to fault lines and fortuitous misunderstandings. January brought the practical challenges of their new living arrangement into sharper focus. Emily's teaching schedule required her presence on campus 3 days a week, a commute made treacherous by winter road conditions. After a particularly harrowing drive that left her stranded for hours, waiting for a snowplow to clear the mountain pass, they agreed she would stay overnight in Millfield on teaching days, using a university guest apartment normally reserved for visiting lecturers. It's only for the winter quarter, Emily assured Tanner as she packed an overnight bag. Once the spring survey starts, I'll have a reduced teaching load, and most of it will be online. Tanner nodded, though he wasn't entirely successful at hiding his disappointment. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the sound of her voice, as she prepared lectures at the kitchen table, to her gentle breathing beside him at night. It's the sensible solution, he agreed, helping her load her car. Just promise me you'll check the weather reports before heading back up here. These storms can develop quickly. Emily stood on tiptoe to kiss him goodbye. I promise, and I'll text when I arrive safely, both directions. The partial separation, while practical, cast a melancholy pall over the following weeks. The cabin seemed too quiet on the nights Emily was absent, the spaces they had adapted for her use standing empty in silent reminder of her absence. Tanner found himself working longer shifts, volunteering for overnight patrols that kept him busy and exhausted enough to fall asleep, despite the emptiness beside him. February brought a welcome thaw, not just in the weather, which briefly moderated, to allow safer travel between Millfield and the mountains, but in their routine. Emily managed to arrange her teaching schedule to require only 2 overnight stays in town, and Tanner adjusted his patrol rotations to match her absences when possible. I've been thinking, Emily said one evening, as they prepared dinner together. It had become their favorite ritual, Tanner handling the tasks that required height, Emily managing the detailed knife work and seasoning with her characteristic precision. Always dangerous, Tanner replied automatically, earning a gentle elbow. To his side, seriously, she continued deftly dicing an onion. The research assistants I've hired will start in April, and will need a base of operations closer to the survey sites than my office in Millfield. Tanner nodded as he retrieved plates from the upper cabinet. Makes sense. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, Emily said slowly, as if testing the words, that we could convert part of the storage shed behind the cabin into a small field lab. Nothing fancy, just enough space for basic sample processing and data entry before we transport everything to the university lab for detailed analysis. Tanner paused, plates in hand. That's actually brilliant. The shed has power, and it would be simple enough to add insulation and proper lighting. Emily's expression brightened. "You don't mind? It would mean having my research assistants here regularly during the survey period." "Mind?" Tanner set down the plates to pull her into an embrace. "Emily, this is your home now. Of course you should have your workspace here." Her smile was radiant. "I've been sketching some plans, modifications to make the space accessible for me while still providing adequate work surfaces for standard height individuals." The project gave them a renewed sense of purpose through the remaining winter weeks. Weekends that might have been spent huddled indoors were instead devoted to transforming the shed into a functional field laboratory. Tanner's carpentry skills proved invaluable as they installed workbenches at varying heights, proper lighting for detailed examination of samples, and storage systems that could accommodate the specialized equipment Emily's grant would provide. By mid-March, as the first hints of spring began to emerge from beneath the winter's snow, the field lab was complete. Emily stood in the center of the space, surveying their work with evident satisfaction. "It's perfect," she declared, running a hand along the smooth surface of the main workbench, which had been custom-built to her height. "Better than any lab space I've had at the university, honestly." Tanner leaned against the doorframe, enjoying her excitement. High praise coming from an academic. "Well-deserved praise," she corrected, turning to face him. "You've made this whole transition so seamless, Tanner. Moving in, adjusting our schedules. Now this," she gestured around the lab. "Most people would have balked at such radical changes to their life. Most people haven't found what I have," he replied simply. The warmth in Emily's eyes deepened. "And what exactly is that, Ranger Coleman?" Tanner crossed the room to take her hands in his. "A partner. Someone who makes every day more interesting than the last. Someone who sees the world with the same appreciation for its wonders, but from a different perspective that enriches my own." Emily squeezed his hands. "That's quite poetic for a man who claims to prefer action to words." "You inspire unexpected qualities," he admitted with a smile. As March gave way to April, the mountains began their annual awakening. Snow receded from the lower elevations, revealing the first delicate wildflowers pushing through the damp earth. Streams swelled with meltwater, creating temporary waterfalls that cascaded down rock faces. And with the changing season came the official start of Emily's comprehensive geological survey. Her research assistants arrived on a sunny Tuesday morning. Mason Reed, a doctoral candidate specializing in seismology, and Lily Chen, a master's student with expertise in geological mapping technologies. Both had been selected not just for their academic qualifications, but for their demonstrated field experience and comfort with rugged terrain. "Welcome to base camp," Emily greeted them, leading the way to the newly completed field lab. "It's not the fancy facilities you might be used to at Western State, but it has everything we need for preliminary processing." Mason, a tall young man with an outdoorsman's weathered complexion, nodded approvingly. "This is great, Dr. Mackenzie. Way better than the tent labs I've worked with on other field projects." Lily, more reserved but equally observant, was already examining the equipment storage system. "These modifications for accessibility are ingenious. Did you design them yourself?" "It was a collaborative effort," Emily replied, exchanging a smile with Tanner, who had taken the morning off to help welcome the research team. "Ranger Coleman deserves most of the credit for the implementation." The first week of the survey established their working rhythm. Each morning, Emily and her assistants would review the day's objectives over breakfast, poring over maps spread across the kitchen table, while Tanner prepared enough coffee to fuel their scientific endeavors. They would then head out to the designated sites, sometimes accompanied by Tanner when his patrol route allowed him to join them, returning in the late afternoon to process the day's samples and findings in the field lab. Evenings often found all four of them on the porch, discussing the emerging patterns in their data, while the sunset painted the distant peaks in hues of gold and rose. Mason and Lily had initially been hesitant to intrude on what was clearly Tanner and Emily's home, but the comfortable atmosphere quickly dispelled their reservations. "I have to admit," Mason said one evening as they shared a meal together, "when you first described your living arrangement, I was skeptical about how it would work for the survey. Academic fieldwork can be pretty all-consuming." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Skeptical why? Because my partner isn't an academic?" Mason had the grace to look slightly abashed. "Partly that, and partly because, well, field geologists aren't known for maintaining work-life balance. We tend to take over spaces with our equipment and samples and endless discussions about rock formations." Tanner chuckled. "In case you haven't noticed, I live with a geologist. I'm well acquainted with the hazards." "What Mason is trying to say," Lily interjected with a gentle smile, "is that it's rare to find someone outside the field who understands and supports the kind of immersive work we do. You've created something special here." The observation lingered with Tanner long after their guests had retired to the small tent cabins set up behind the main house for the duration of the survey. Emily found him still on the porch when she returned from a final check of the lab equipment. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, settling beside him on the swing. "Just thinking about what Lily said," he replied, automatically adjusting the swing to accommodate her presence. "About creating something special." Emily nodded. "It is special, isn't it? Not just the research, though that's exciting, but this life we're building. Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed in less than a year." "For the better?" he couldn't help asking, though he was reasonably confident of her answer. "Infinitely better," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder. "Though if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be living in a mountain cabin with a park ranger who initially mistook me for a lost child, I'd have thought you were delusional." Tanner laughed. "When you put it that way, it does sound improbable." Best things often are," Emily replied, her voice softening with drowsiness. The long days of fieldwork were taking their toll, though she would never admit it. As April progressed into May, the survey results began to coalesce into a compelling narrative. The fault line Emily had first suspected was indeed present, running through the eastern quadrant of the park in a pattern that hadn't been previously documented in geological surveys of the region. The dating of these mineral formations suggests the fault has been inactive for at least 2 centuries. Emily explained during a video conference with Professor Lawrence and other department members. "But the structural evidence indicates it's not extinct, just dormant." Lawrence's face on the laptop screen looked suitably impressed. "The implications for regional seismic risk assessment are significant. Have you determined the fault's potential magnitude if it were to become active?" "Preliminary calculations suggest capacity for a 5.7 to 6.2 event," Mason interjected, pointing to a graph. "Not catastrophic, but certainly substantial enough to cause damage to infrastructure in the surrounding communities. And with the increasing development at the eastern boundary of the park." Emily let the implication hang. Lawrence nodded gravely. "This needs to be brought to the attention of regional planning authorities." "Excellent work, Dr. Mackenzie. Your team's findings could potentially influence building codes and emergency preparedness protocols for the entire area." After the call ended, Emily sat for a moment in silence, absorbing the magnitude of what they'd accomplished. "We did it," she said finally, looking around at Mason and Lily. "We actually proved it." The celebration that evening was well earned. Steaks grilled on the porch, a bottle of champagne that Tanner had secretly purchased weeks earlier in anticipation of this moment, and the satisfied exhaustion that comes from seeing a long-held theory validated through meticulous work. As Mason and Lily chatted animatedly about the next phases of the project, Tanner pulled Emily aside, leading her to the edge of the porch, where the view of the mountains stretched out before them, now bathed in moonlight. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. I've been waiting for the right moment, and this seems like it. Emily looked up at him curiously as he placed a small object in her palm, a polished stone pendant on a silver chain. The stone was unusual, banded with layers of deep blue and green that caught the light with an almost iridescent quality. "It's beautiful," she breathed, turning it in her fingers. "What kind of stone is this?" "Labradorite," Tanner replied. "I found it at Tyler's Lake last summer, just after our first visit there together. It reminded me of you, how you see layers and patterns that others miss, how you find beauty in what most people would walk right past." Emily's eyes glistened as she looked up from the pendant. "Tanner, thank you. This means more than any academic recognition." He took the necklace from her hands and fastened it around her neck, the stone resting just below her collarbone. "It suits you," he said softly. "A remarkable stone for a remarkable woman." Back inside, Mason was recounting an amusing mishap from the day's fieldwork, something involving a startled marmot and a dropped sample bag. But Emily's attention remained on the pendant, her fingers periodically rising to touch it as if to confirm its presence. Later, as they prepared for bed, Emily's mood turned reflective. "You know, a year ago I was fighting just to be taken seriously in my department. Now I have a funded research project, a team that respects me, professional recognition." She looked up at Tanner with an expression that made his heart swell. "And a home with someone who sees me, truly sees me." Tanner understood the layers in her statement, how being seen went beyond the physical for someone who had spent a lifetime being misjudged based on appearance. "I'm the fortunate one," he said, pulling her close. "I found someone who showed me life could be full again, even after losing what I thought was irreplaceable." Emily's arms tightened around him. "Do you think Tyler would approve of us, of how you've moved forward?" It was a question she'd never asked before, though Tanner had often considered it himself. "I know he would," he said with quiet certainty. "He was always telling me to get out more, even as a teenager. Said I was becoming a hermit before my time." Emily laughed softly. "Smart kid." "The smartest," Tanner agreed, the familiar ache of loss now tempered by the warmth of fond remembrance rather than sharp with grief. "He would have liked you, your determination, your passion for what you do, and he would have been fascinated by your fault line discovery." "I wish I could have known him," Emily said simply. "In a way you do," Tanner replied. "Through me, through this place he loved, through the stories I've shared. He's still here, part of who I am and now part of what we're building together." As they settled into sleep, Tanner reflected on the strange, winding path that had led to this moment. A mistaken rescue on a foggy ridge had somehow resulted in the rescue of his heart from the isolation he'd built around it. And Emily, so often underestimated because of her stature, had proven herself the stronger of the two. Brave enough to open her life to someone new, to blend her ambitions with shared dreams without diminishing either. Outside, the mountains stood sentinel under the starlit sky, ancient and enduring, like the bond forming between two unlikely souls who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were searching for. Summer arrived in the Cascades with an intensity that seemed to mirror the pace of Emily's research. The comprehensive survey had expanded beyond their initial expectations, drawing attention from geological societies across the country. What had begun as a personal quest to prove a theory had evolved into a significant scientific contribution that would impact regional safety planning for decades to come. By July, the fieldwork phase was winding down. Mason and Lily had returned to campus to focus on data analysis, leaving Tanner and Emily to settle back into the rhythm of life without the constant presence of research assistants. The field lab stood quiet but ready, a testament to the work, accomplished and a promise of future projects. "I almost miss having them around," Tanner admitted one evening as they sat on the porch, watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the distant peaks. "The cabin seems too quiet now." Emily smiled, her fingers absently touching the labradorite pendant that had become a constant accessory. "You've come a long way from the solitary ranger who valued his isolation above all else." "I've had good reason to reconsider my priorities," he replied, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze. The official presentation of the survey findings was scheduled for early August, a symposium at Western State University that would bring together academics, local government officials, and representatives from various public safety agencies. As the date approached, Emily divided her time between preparing her presentation and making final visits to key sites within the park, often accompanied by Tanner during his off-duty hours. "Are you nervous about the symposium?" he asked as they hiked along a ridge that offered a spectacular view of the fault line's path, visible now to his eyes thanks to Emily's patient instruction in reading the landscape's geological story. "Terrified," she admitted, with a candor she reserved for him alone. "Not about the science, the evidence speaks for itself, but standing in front of all those people, knowing some of them will be seeing me for the first time." She didn't need to elaborate. Despite her accomplishments, Emily still faced the reality that her physical appearance often became the focus of attention in new professional settings, sometimes overshadowing her expertise. "They'll be too busy being impressed by your brilliance to notice anything else," Tanner assured her, though he understood her concern was based on a lifetime of experiences that couldn't be dismissed with simple reassurances. Emily's smile acknowledged both his support and its limitations. "Lawrence has been surprisingly helpful with the planning. He's made sure the podium is adjustable and arranged the schedule so my presentation is first, before everyone is distracted by information overload." "The power of proven results," Tanner observed. "Nothing changes minds like irrefutable evidence." The morning of the symposium dawned clear and warm. Tanner had taken the day off to attend, exchanging his ranger uniform for one of the few suits he still owned from his lawyer days, now altered to fit his leaner frame. Emily emerged from the bedroom in a tailored blazer and skirt, professional but distinctly her own style, the labradorite pendant providing a personal touch against the formal attire. "Ready?" Tanner asked, holding out his hand. Emily took a deep breath and nodded, linking her fingers with his. "As I'll ever be." The drive to Millfield was filled with Emily's final review of her presentation points, Tanner offering occasional feedback but mostly providing the steady, calming presence she needed. By the time they arrived at the university's conference center, her nervous energy had transformed into focused determination. The auditorium was nearly full, a testament to the interest Emily's research had generated. Tanner found a seat in the front row as Emily disappeared backstage, with Professor Lawrence and the other presenters for final preparations. Ranger Coleman. Tanner turned to find Diane sliding into the seat beside him, dressed in her formal Park Service uniform. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, genuinely surprised. Diane smiled. "Official Park Service representation." The director was impressed by the potential impact of Dr. Mackenzie's findings on our safety protocols. "Plus," she added with a wink, "I wouldn't miss seeing the culmination of a project that began with a misguided rescue attempt on Deadman's Ridge." Before Tanner could respond, the lights dimmed and Professor Lawrence stepped onto the stage to welcome the attendees and introduce the symposium's focus on regional geological discoveries and their implications for public safety. Our first presenter has identified a previously undocumented fault system running through the eastern section of Evergreen Ridge National Park, Lawrence announced, his voice carrying an unmistakable note of pride. Her meticulous research has not only expanded our understanding of the region's seismic potential, but provides critical data for future development planning. Please welcome Dr. Emily Mackenzie, The applause was polite but expectant as Emily walked onto the stage. Tanner felt a surge of pride as she took her position behind the podium, which had indeed been adjusted to her height. There was a brief moment when she scanned the audience, her eyes finding him with a small smile before she launched into her presentation. From the first slide, a dramatic photograph of Eagle's Cleft with its telling geological features highlighted, Emily commanded, "The room!" Her voice was steady and authoritative as she walked the audience through the evidence, the methodology, and the implications of her team's findings. The technical aspects were presented with clarity that made them accessible even to the non-scientists. In attendance, while the depth of analysis satisfied the academic rigor expected by her peers, the dormant fault system, which we've named the Evergreen Fault, shows no signs of imminent activation, she concluded after 40 minutes that had passed in what seemed like moments. However, its presence necessitates a re-evaluation of building codes and emergency response plans for communities within the potential impact zone. The comprehensive report provided in your symposium materials includes specific recommendations, developed in consultation with seismic safety experts. The applause that followed was anything but polite. It was enthusiastic, punctuated by several attendees rising to their feet in recognition of the presentation's excellence. Tanner was among the first standing, his chest tight with emotion, as he watched Emily acknowledge the response with a modest nod before fielding questions with the confidence of someone who knew her subject completely. The remainder of the symposium passed in a blur of technical presentations that, while informative, lacked the compelling combination of scientific rigor and practical relevance that had characterized Emily's work. During the lunch break, she was surrounded by colleagues and officials eager to discuss potential collaborations or implementations of her findings. "Your girl's the star of the show," Diane commented as she and Tanner found seats at a table near the windows overlooking the university quad. "She worked hard for this," Tanner replied, watching as Emily engaged animatedly with a group of civil engineers. "It's a well-deserved recognition. And to think it all started because you thought—" "She was a lost child," Diane mused, shaking her head with amusement. "The universe works in mysterious ways." By late afternoon, as the symposium concluded with a panel discussion on integrating geological research into public policy, Tanner could see fatigue beginning to show in the set of Emily's shoulders despite her continued engagement. When the final applause faded and attendees began to disperse, he made his way through the crowd to her side. "Ready to head home?" he asked quietly. The relief in her eyes was answer enough, though she nodded politely to a few more well-wishers before they could make their escape. In the car, Emily kicked off her shoes with a sigh of contentment. That, she declared, was simultaneously the most exhilarating and exhausting day of my professional life. "You were amazing," Tanner said simply, reaching across to squeeze her. My hand. Everyone in that room knew they were witnessing something important. Emily's smile was tired but satisfied. It felt right presenting it there, bringing everything full circle from where it began with a department chair who didn't believe me and a theory no one wanted to fund. "Speaking of full circles," Tanner said as they turned onto the mountain road that would take them home, "I have something in mind for this evening, if you're not too tired." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Intriguing. What kind of something?" "A celebration, but it requires a short hike." Despite her fatigue, Emily's eyes lit with curiosity. "You know I can't resist a mysterious expedition. How short is short?" 20 minutes, give or take. We'll change clothes first." Back at the cabin, they exchanged their formal attire for comfortable hiking gear, Emily asking questions that Tanner deflected with practiced ease. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they set off along a familiar trail, the one leading to Tyler's Lake. "The lake?" Emily asked, recognizing the route. "It's a perfect choice for today." Tanner smiled, but said nothing, his hand finding hers as they walked in comfortable silence through the dappled forest light. When they reached the ridge overlooking the lake, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, turning the water's surface to burnished gold. "It's beautiful," Emily breathed, the view never failing to inspire awe despite her many visits over the past year. "It's always been a place for important moments," Tanner said, his voice carrying a hint of something that made Emily look up at him curiously. "Tyler and I discovered it by accident. I shared my grief here. You and I found a deeper connection here. It seemed right that this next step should happen here too." Before Emily could ask what he meant, Tanner knelt on the rocky ground before her, reaching into his pocket to produce a small wooden box. Her breath caught as understanding dawned. "Emily Mackenzie," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "You walked into my life, or rather, I ran into yours, in the most unexpected way imaginable. What started as an embarrassing misunderstanding has become the most significant relationship of my life." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not a traditional diamond, but a band of polished silver inlaid with small pieces of labradorite that matched her pendant. "I've learned from you that the most meaningful discoveries often require seeing beyond the surface, recognizing patterns others miss, and having the courage to follow evidence, even when it leads somewhere unexpected." His voice grew softer, intimate in the mountain stillness. "I can't imagine navigating this life without you as my partner. Will you marry me?" Emily's eyes glistened with tears that spilled over as she nodded, unable to speak for a moment before finding her voice. "Yes, Tanner, yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, its size perfect, thanks to careful observation and a discreet consultation with a jeweler in Millfield. Standing, he gathered her into an embrace that conveyed everything words couldn't capture: the miraculous nature of their finding each other, the depth of connection that had grown between them, the promise of a future built on mutual respect and understanding. When they finally separated, Emily examined the ring with wonder. "It's perfect, completely us. Where did you find labradorite that matches my pendant?" "I didn't," Tanner admitted with a smile. "I went back to Tyler's Lake last month and searched until I found more of the same stone. The jeweler said it was unusual to find such quality specimens outside of specialized suppliers. You found it yourself?" Emily's voice held a note of astonishment. "That makes it even more special." They made their way down to the shore, to the flat rock that had become their regular spot for reflection. The setting sun painted the sky in dramatic hues of pink and gold, reflecting on the water's surface in a display that seemed orchestrated. "For the occasion, I was thinking," Tanner said as they sat side by side, Emily's head resting against his shoulder, "that this might be the perfect place for a wedding. Small, intimate, with the mountains as witnesses." Emily considered the idea, her thumb brushing across the surface of her new ring. "It's beautiful, but are you sure? No family, no tradition. My most meaningful family connections are already here," Tanner replied softly. "Tyler in memory, you in presence. As for tradition, I think we've demonstrated that we're better at creating our own." Emily's smile widened. "A wedding at the lake it is, then. Though we should probably wait until after the American Geological Society conference in October. I've been invited to present our findings there too." "October it is," Tanner agreed. "The fall colors will be spectacular." As dusk settled over the mountains, they remained by the lake, planning their future in quiet conversation that felt like a continuation of the journey they'd begun on that foggy morning on Deadman's Ridge. The path that had led them here had been unexpected, marked by misconceptions overcome, and perspectives shifted, but neither would have changed a single step. 3 months later, on a crisp October afternoon with the surrounding forest ablaze in autumn colors, A small gathering assembled at Tyler's Lake. Diane stood as official witness, along with Professor Lawrence Mason and Lily. Mac, from the Broken Antler, had insisted on providing champagne for the occasion, carrying it up the trail himself, despite Tanner's protests that it wasn't necessary. Emily wore a simple dress in a shade of blue that matched the labradorite, in her pendant and ring, with sturdy hiking boots underneath that made Tanner smile when he caught a glimpse of them as she navigated the trail. He waited for her at the shoreline, dressed in formal ranger attire at Emily's request, the uniform that represented not just his profession, but the life he had built in these mountains. The ceremony was brief, but profound, their vows written, together to honor both their individual strengths and their shared journey. When the judge pronounced them married, the small assembly erupted in cheers that echoed across the water, startling a pair of eagles that had been circling overhead. Later, as their friends shared a picnic celebration on the grassy shore, Tanner and Emily slipped away briefly to the flat rock that held so many memories. "Happy?" Tanner asked, though the answer was evident in the radiance of her expression. "Beyond words," Emily replied, leaning against him as they looked out over the lake. That had become the heart of their story. "Though I can't help but think how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't mistaken me for a lost child that day." Tanner chuckled, the memory now a source of amusement rather than embarrassment. "I maintain it was a reasonable error given the circumstances. The visibility was rather poor," Emily conceded with a mischievous smile, "and I was wearing that ridiculously bright yellow jacket." "Which you still wear on every expedition," Tanner pointed out. "Though I've learned to recognize you by a lot more than your outerwear." Emily's expression softened. "You see me as I am. Not many people do that. And you see me, past the grief, past the isolation I built around myself. We found each other, when neither of us was looking, and somehow it was exactly what we both needed." The sound of laughter from their wedding party drifted across the water, a reminder of the community they had built together. Friends who respected Emily for her brilliance rather than defining her by her stature. Colleagues who had welcomed Tanner despite his lack of academic credentials, recognizing the value of his practical knowledge and unwavering support. "We should get back," Emily said after a moment, though she made no move to rise, "before they send a search party." "Let them wait a minute longer," Tanner replied, drawing her closer. "I want to remember this moment exactly as it is. You and me, this mountain, this lake, the beginning of our next chapter." As they rejoined their celebration, Tanner caught sight of a subtle ray of sunlight breaking through the clouds to illuminate the lake's surface, a phenomenon he had witnessed many times over the years. Once he had interpreted such moments as Tyler's presence, a connection to what he had lost. Now, while that association remained, it was joined by a new understanding that life, like the mountains themselves, was a study in layers. Grief could exist alongside joy, memory alongside new experience, endings alongside beginnings. Emily slipped her hand into his, the labradorite ring catching the same shaft of sunlight. "What are you thinking about with that expression?" she asked softly. "Fault lines," Tanner answered, surprising her. "How the places where we break can also be the places where the most interesting features emerge." Emily's smile was knowing and tender, a surprisingly geological metaphor from someone who claims to leave science to me. "I've learned from the best," he replied, leading her back to their waiting friends, to the celebration of a union that had begun with a misunderstanding on a foggy ridge, and grew into a love as enduring as the mountains that had brought them together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't Miss any upload from us?